He had woken before dawn, long before his alarm, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling as if they might rearrange themselves into a sign that everything would finally be all right. The apartment was silent except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing of his 6-year-old son, Noah, asleep in the next room. Daniel lay there for a moment, feeling the familiar weight on his chest, the kind that came from too many responsibilities and too few options, but beneath it flickered something fragile and bright. Today was the interview, a real one, not a temporary contract, not a night shift with no benefits, but a full-time position at a respected logistics firm downtown, with health insurance, predictable hours, and a salary that could finally lift them out of the constant arithmetic of survival. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Noah, and pulled on the only suit he owned, a charcoal jacket that had seen better days but still held its shape when he stood straight. He ironed his shirt in the dim kitchen light, moving slowly, deliberately, as if precision alone could guarantee success. On the table sat a worn leather folder containing printed copies of his resume, references, and a list of carefully rehearsed answers. He had practiced in front of the mirror the night before, speaking about leadership, crisis management, and efficiency, omitting the unpolished truth that his greatest leadership experience had been guiding a grieving child through sleepless nights after losing his mother. When Noah shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, Daniel crouched to hug him, breathing in the warm, familiar scent of shampoo and sleep. "Big day, right?" Noah asked, his voice still thick with dreams. Daniel smiled and nodded. "Big day," he agreed, trying to make it sound ordinary. He prepared breakfast, tied Noah's sneakers, and walked him to the neighbor's apartment where Mrs. Alvarez would watch him after school. With each step toward the bus stop, Daniel felt his heartbeat sinking with the ticking clock on his wrist. He calculated the timing carefully. Bus at 8:15, arrival downtown by 9:05, interview at 9:30. Enough margin for confidence, not enough for disaster. The bus arrived late. Not catastrophically late, but late enough to stir anxiety into something sharper. He stared out the window as traffic thickened, willing the cars ahead to move faster, silently rehearsing his opening line. When his stop finally came into view, he stepped off and began walking briskly toward the towering glass building just 3 blocks away. That was when he heard the screech, metal tearing against metal, a violent collision that seemed to split the morning in two. A small sedan had spun across the intersection, striking a lamppost before jolting to a stop. Smoke drifted upward, thin at first, then heavier. For a second, everything froze. Pedestrians halted mid-step. Drivers slowed, some lifting phones to record. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, his folder clutched in one hand, heart hammering. He glanced at his watch. 9:18. 12 minutes. Close enough to see the building, far enough that stopping would mean forfeiting his chance. Someone would call emergency services, he reasoned. Someone closer, someone without as much to lose. Then he saw her through the cracked windshield. A woman in her 20s, head tilted unnaturally against the steering wheel, blood tracing a narrow path along her cheek. The smoke thickened. Time fractured into unbearable clarity. He thought of Noah's face that morning, hopeful and trusting. He thought of overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter. He thought of the word responsibility and how it sometimes demanded more than comfort. His feet moved before his doubts could anchor them. He ran. The driver's door resisted, jammed from impact, so he circled to the passenger side, yanking it open with shaking hands. The scent of gasoline stung his nose. "Can you hear me?" he called, leaning inside. Her eyelids fluttered faintly. Relief and fear collided inside him. He dialed emergency services, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, giving precise details of location and condition. A thin ribbon of flame flickered beneath the hood, subtle but terrifying. He knew he didn't have long. Ignoring the shards of glass biting into his palm, he reached across her, fumbling with the seatbelt until it clicked free. Carefully, he slid one arm behind her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, lifting with a strength fueled not by certainty but by urgency. She was limp, frighteningly fragile, but he managed to pull her clear of the car and stagger several yards away before lowering her gently onto the pavement. The smoke darkened. A small explosion cracked from beneath the hood, sending a wave of heat across his back. Bystanders gasped. Daniel knelt beside her, pressing his jacket against the wound on her forehead, whispering reassurance he wasn't sure she could hear. "Stay with me. Help is coming." Sirens pierced the air moments later, growing louder, closer, until paramedics rushed in with purposeful efficiency. They took over seamlessly, assessing, stabilizing, loading her onto a stretcher. One of them glanced at Daniel's blood-streaked shirt and asked if he was injured. He shook his head, only then noticing the sting in his hand and the trembling in his legs. "You pulled her out?" the paramedic asked. Daniel nodded. The man gave him a look that carried unspoken gravity. "You got her out just in time." Daniel turned toward the intersection where traffic had resumed its restless flow. He checked his watch again. 9:37. The interview had already begun. Through the glass facade of the nearby building, he could see suited figures moving with purpose, unaware of the choice that had just been made a block away. He looked down at his ruined shirt, his empty hands where his folder had fallen in the chaos, and felt the sharp sting of consequence settling in. Yet beneath the disappointment, beneath the fear of what this would mean for him and Noah, there was an unshakable stillness. A life had been pulled back from the edge. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing with painful clarity. He would make the same choice again. By the time Daniel returned home that evening, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, heavier than the dried blood on his cuff and more persistent than the ache in his scraped knuckles. The adrenaline that had carried him through the chaos was gone, replaced by a hollow quiet that made every thought echo. He had called the company from a bench outside the hospital after ensuring the woman had been taken into surgery. The receptionist's voice had been courteous but cool, informing him that the interview panel had waited 10 minutes before proceeding with other candidates. Policies were policies. They appreciated his interest. They would be in touch. He knew those words were a soft dismissal dressed as professionalism. On the bus ride home, he stared at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing not a hero but a man who had gambled stability on instinct. He wondered how he would explain it to Noah without sounding reckless. Yet when he opened the apartment door and saw his son rush toward him, eyes bright and trusting, the doubt softened. Noah listened wide-eyed as Daniel recounted a gentler version of the story, leaving out the flames and the fear, focusing instead on how important it was to help someone in trouble. "Like superheroes?" Noah asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Like people," he replied. That night, after Noah fell asleep clutching a worn stuffed bear, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table with unpaid bills fanned out before him like quiet accusations. He calculated what little savings remained, how many extra shifts he could request at the warehouse, how long they could stretch groceries without it feeling like deprivation. Regret hovered at the edges of his mind, but it never fully formed. Every time it tried, he saw again the thin line of blood on the stranger's face, the smoke curling upward, the flicker of flame. Some choices rearranged your priorities permanently. The next morning passed in a blur of routine. Packing lunch, walking Noah to school, nodding politely to neighbors who had no idea how precarious his world felt. He had just returned home and begun drafting new job applications when a firm knock sounded at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a fleeting, irrational second, he feared it might be someone bringing bad news from the hospital. When he opened the door, he found the woman from the accident standing there, her arm secured in a sling, a small bandage near her hairline, but very much alive. Her eyes held recognition and something deeper, gratitude edged with disbelief. "You're Daniel," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He nodded, momentarily speechless. She introduced herself as Claire, explaining that the paramedics had given her his name when she regained consciousness, and insisted on knowing who had pulled her from the car. "They told me if you hadn't acted when you did." Her voice faltered. She steadied herself. "I wouldn't be here." Daniel shifted awkwardly, uncomfortable with praise. "I'm glad you're okay," he said simply. Claire glanced around the modest apartment, taking in the worn furniture, the stack of job listings on the table, the evidence of a life managed carefully and without excess. They also told me you missed something important because of me, she continued. He exhaled slowly. An interview. It's fine. These things happen. She studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the sincerity in his tone. The company you were interviewing with, she said carefully, is part of my family's firm. The words landed with quiet force. Daniel blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. She explained that her father founded the logistics corporation decades ago, and that she served on its executive board. She had been driving to that very building when the accident occurred. When I heard your name and where you were headed, she said, I asked for your file. His heart pounded again, but for entirely different reasons. Claire stepped inside at his hesitant gesture and placed a large envelope on the kitchen table. I read your resume. Your experience, your references, they're strong. But what matters more is what you did yesterday. You didn't hesitate. Daniel felt the room narrow, every sound amplifying. The ticking clock, the distant hum of traffic. We can train people for leadership, she continued, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her posture. We can't train integrity under pressure. He stared at the envelope without touching it, afraid the moment might dissolve if he moved too quickly. Claire smiled faintly. The position is yours if you still want it. Same role. Higher starting salary. My father insisted. The air left Daniel's lungs in a rush he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the previous morning. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers, scanning the official letterhead, the formal offer, the signature at the bottom. It was real. Not a polite consolation, not charity disguised as gratitude, but an acknowledgement of both his qualifications and his character. Emotion rose unexpectedly, tightening his throat. You don't owe me this, he managed. Claire shook her head. I owe you my life. This isn't repayment. It's recognition. From the hallway, Noah peeked around the corner, sensing something significant. Claire knelt carefully, introducing herself and thanking him for sharing his father with a stranger in need. Noah beamed with shy pride. In that small apartment, amid peeling paint and unpaid bills, something shifted, like a window opening after a long winter. When Claire finally left, promising to see him Monday morning at the office under far calmer circumstances, Daniel sank into a chair, overwhelmed not just by relief but by the strange symmetry of it all. He had believed that stopping at the accident had cost him his future. Instead, it had revealed it. Hours earlier, he had stood on a street corner convinced that compassion and responsibility were at odds. Now he understood they were the same force, pulling him toward the kind of man he wanted his son to become. He looked at Noah, who threw his arms around him without fully grasping the magnitude of what had occurred. Daniel held him tightly, realizing that sometimes the path to security is not carved by ambition alone, but by the quiet, inconvenient choice to care when it would be easier not to.